My brother swore my wife and his friend were only helping during moving day. Then music cut as a shared album timestamp pulled their ex-history into view before he threatened my inheritance cut that night. By the time the music cut, I had already told myself twice that I was being unfair. Moving day does that to you. It makes everybody shorter with each other, makes every little glance look intentional, makes help feel intrusive even when you asked for it. My brother Dean had shown up early with his friend Marla and 3 rolls of packing tape like he was staging a rescue. Tessa, my wife, had smiled too quickly when she saw Marla in the front hall. But I had let that pass because there were boxes stacked to the ceiling, a rental van idling out front, and my new townhouse suddenly full of people pretending not to notice that half our life still smelled like old cardboard and dust. Dean kept saying the same thing every 20 minutes, like repetition could make it true. She's just helping. Not Marla is great with boxes. Not Marla knows how to wrap glassware. She's just helping, which is the kind of sentence that only sounds normal if nobody already suspects it's covering something else. I was carrying a lamp base through the townhouse front hall when Marla asked if anyone wanted the moving photos she'd been taking. Dean said, "Throw them in the shared album," and she laughed and said she already had. Tessa was kneeling by one of the open kitchen boxes, taping shut a crate of plates, and she said, "Send me the link again." Mine didn't refresh. That was how the timestamp showed up. Marla handed Tessa her phone for 1 second while I was still close enough to see the screen. The album was open already. The top row was today's mess boxes. The van, Dean pretending to lift a couch by himself. But below that sat an older image cluster, same shared album title, and under one thumbnail I saw a date marker and upload time before Marla tried to tilt it away. April 17, 8, 42. Everyone in my family remembers April 17. That was the date Dean told me. Tessa and Marla had only re-met in passing after years of not speaking, when the 3 of us were at my mother's memorial dinner, and he had laughed off the weirdness in the room by telling me I was inventing chemistry where there was just old history. He had said their past was ancient and stupid and over before I ever knew either of them. I put the lamp base down harder than I meant to. The music from Dean's speaker cut at the exact same second, maybe because the battery died, maybe because nobody had touched it in an hour, and the whole front hall went still in that ugly practical silence that only happens when a room full of people realizes something personal has just entered the job. Tessa looked up first, then Dean, then Marla. I said, "Why is April 17th in the moving album?" Nobody answered right away. That mattered more than the date itself. Marla reached for the phone. "It's just an old upload." Dean jumped in too fast. Shared albums pull weird stuff sometimes. Tessa still hadn't moved. She had the tape gun in one hand and this fixed look on her face that I could not read cleanly. Shock, maybe, or calculation. With Tessa, those are uncomfortably close sometimes. And I know that sounds bitter, but if you had watched your wife become extra careful every time your brother's friend entered a room, you'd know what I mean. I took the phone from Marla before Dean could intercept it. Not rough, just direct enough that nobody could pretend I was asking casually. The photo itself was nothing dramatic. That made it worse. A dim restaurant table, 2 drinks, one of Marla's sleeves in the corner, a second hand, half visible near the bottom edge, a ring I recognized as Tessa's because I bought it in Santa Barbara on a weekend trip she almost canceled and then later called one of our best days. The timestamp sat under the image plain as a bruise. April 17, 8, 42 p.m. Tessa stood up slowly. "Ryan, that was my name," in her warning voice, the one that means, not here, not now, don't make people watch me do this. Dean gave a short laugh that had no humor in it. "You're not seriously doing this in the middle of unloading." "In the middle of unloading," I said. "My wife's hand just showed up in a shared album on a date you told me meant nothing." Marla said, "That is not what this is." "Then what is it?" The front door was open behind us. I could hear the van beep once as somebody outside shifted weight near the ramp. Soft shift, street noise, cardboard scrape. That front hall smell of dust and heat. Real life still moving while the four of us stood around a phone that had somehow made all the air thinner. Dean folded his arms. "It's an old photo." "Yes," I said. "I know what old means. You're acting like a timestamp is a confession." I looked at him instead of Tessa because that was the first thing that felt off in a way I could name. He was answering for both of them, not stepping in to calm things down, steering, managing. Tessa finally took one step toward me. "Let me see." I turned the phone so she could. She looked at the screen and didn't fake confusion. That was another thing I noticed. She didn't say what photo, or why is that there, or I forgot that existed. She just got quiet in a way that made Marla look suddenly younger and Dean look angrier. "It's from spring," Tessa said. I almost laughed. "The timestamp told me that." "Thanks," Dean said. "Don't start talking to her like she owes you a crime scene explanation because of one old upload." One old upload. The problem with sentences like that is they never help innocent people as much as liars think they do. I wasn't accusing anyone of sleeping together in the front hall of my new house. I was asking why a shared album that was supposed to be about moving day had quietly pulled an image from a date I specifically remembered being explained away to me months ago. And yes, maybe I was already loaded for it. Maybe that's part of the truth. Tessa and Marla had a history before me. Brief, according to Dean. Pointless, according to Tessa. Embarrassing, according to Marla, the one time she joked about college-level bad judgment and then never brought it up again. I had accepted that because adults are allowed to have old histories. What I had not accepted, what I had not even been asked to accept, was the possibility that the history had stayed active enough to show up on a remembered date, in a private album, while my brother kept acting like my discomfort was a personality problem. I zoomed in on the photo, the second drink, the edge of Tessa's wrist. Nothing explicit, nothing I could point to and say, "There." That is betrayal. Just the social humiliation of recognizing your own wife from fragments in somebody else's archive and knowing the room is watching your face while you do it. Tessa said, more quietly, "Ryan, this isn't what you're making it." Dean snapped, "Exactly." I looked at him. "Why are you the one who keeps answering?" He stepped closer, not aggressive exactly, but enough to fill the front hall like he owned the choke point between the stairs and the open door. "Because you're about to turn moving day into one of your weird courtroom moods." That stung because it was not fully invented. I do have a habit of locking onto details and flattening everything else until the detail gives me what I need. My brother has called me that way since we were kids. Careful when he's being generous. Obsessive when he wants to win. Maybe somebody else would have let it go. Maybe a better husband would have waited until the last box was inside. But everyone in that front hall had seen the screen. Everyone had watched Tessa fail to look surprised and Dean jump in before she could answer. Once the moment is public, patience stops being neutral. It starts looking like surrender. I said, "April 17th. Dean's jaw tightened. "Yeah? That was the memorial dinner." Marla looked down. Tessa did not. And that was when I knew the date hurt because everybody in the hall recognized it, not just me. Nobody touched a box for a full 10 seconds after I said the date out loud. It is strange how quickly a room can stop being about labor. 1 second there are lamps, tape, scraped knuckles, somebody asking where the bathroom trash bags went. The next second, all that still exists. But it has moved to the background because everyone near the front hall is recalculating what they have already seen. April 17th. My brother knew that date. Tessa knew it. Marla definitely knew it. That was the ugliest part. Not that I was the only one remembering, but that I wasn't. Dean recovered first, because of course he did. He always recovers first. That has been his talent since childhood. He can feel a room lean and get underneath it before anyone else finishes processing why. "It was after dinner," he said. "People went for drinks. This is not some secret." I kept looking at the phone. The picture was still ordinary in the most aggravating way possible. Dim light, glasses, a slice of someone's sleeve. Tessa's hand near the bottom edge, no faces, no kiss, no proof anyone outside the four of us would call definitive. Just enough shape to make every prior reassurance feel edited. I said, You told me they ran into each other in passing. Dean shrugged one shoulder. They did. That looks longer than passing. That looks like a cropped photo. Tessa finally stepped closer, close enough that I could smell cardboard dust on her sweater. Ryan, we left with a group that looks invisible. It was loud. People moved around. Marla said, I was taking pictures all night. Stuff uploads weird. There was the second too-neat explanation in under a minute. Stuff uploads weird. Shared albums pull weird stuff. Old photo. Group night. Everybody was throwing out small technical reasons and social excuses. None of them impossible. All of them somehow making the center worse instead of better. I handed the phone back to Marla, but slowly, like I wanted all three of them to understand I was not dropping the point just because the device changed hands. If it was nothing, I said, why does everybody look like I walked in on a second conversation? Dean let out a sharp breath. Because you're doing that thing. What thing? The thing where one detail becomes a religion. That would have been funny if my wife and his friend had not both gone quiet in exactly the same way at exactly the wrong moment. He wanted me to sound obsessive, because obsessive is easier to dismiss than observant. And to be fair, maybe sometimes the difference is thinner than I like to admit. I know how I can get. I know I hold on to fragments too long. If somebody later told me I turned a bad, awkward old history clue into something larger because moving day had already wired me tight, I would not be able to call them a liar. But Dean was still the one speaking over my wife. I turned to Tessa. Why didn't you say anything when you saw the photo? She rubbed the side of her thumb with the tape gun handle. Tiny motion. Nervous, maybe. Or just irritated at being forced into a public explanation. Because I knew what you'd hear. Which is, that Dean had lied to you, that I had lied to you, that somehow this means something now. Does it? No. Too quick. That bothered me more than if she had hesitated. A hesitation at least feels human. Instant denial after months of careful minimization feels prepared. And maybe that was unfair of me. Maybe she only sounded ready because she had already had to answer versions of this in her own head. Maybe she had anticipated my suspicion long before I said it out loud. Maybe everybody in the hall had. That possibility made me feel stupid in a different way. Dean said, Can we not do this with movers outside and half the house open? There are no movers, I said. There's you, your friend, and my wife. Exactly. It took me a second to hear what he had just done. He had erased the room down to the only people who mattered. Not to make it private. To make it smaller, more manageable, easier to pressure. My brother has always been best when the audience gets narrowed and the moral language gets widened. He could make nearly anything sound like family maintenance if you let him talk for long enough. The speaker on the windowsill woke back up with some half-charged shuffle, and soft guitar started bleeding into the hall. Dean reached over and muted it immediately. That little motion, absurdly, made everything feel even more serious. He had chosen silence now. Soft shift, music off, front door still open, street noise coming in. Somebody outside dragging a dolly across the walkway. The ordinary sounds only made the stillness between us feel more deliberate. Tessa said, Ryan, look at me. I did. Her face was controlled, but not calm. I've been married to her long enough to know when she is holding the center of herself together by pinching harder around the edges. It was after your mother's dinner, she said. Marla and I ended up talking longer than expected because we hadn't cleared old weirdness. That is what happened. That was the first explanation that had some actual shape. And because it had shape, it also had teeth. Old weirdness, I said. Marla looked like she wanted to disappear into the coat closet. Dean looked ready to fight me on her behalf before I had even chosen my next sentence. That, more than anything, made me keep going. What exactly needed clearing? Marla answered before Tessa could. College stuff. Dean cut in on top of her. Ancient, Tessa said at the same time. Nothing current. All three voices overlapping. Three people trying to define the same history at once. That never helps. I laughed under my breath. Couldn't help it. This is incredible. Dean stepped in again. No. What's incredible is that you are doing this in the doorway of your own house over a cropped picture from months ago. It's not over the picture, I said. It's over the date. And the fact that you remember the date too. That landed. For the first time, Dean didn't have a sentence ready. He just stared at me, and in that stare I could see the switch from brother mode to threat assessment. Not physical. Never that with him. Social. Financial. Family level. Dean only ever gets dangerous through the things people depend on. Tessa noticed it too. Dean. He ignored her. I said, "You told me after the memorial dinner that the past between them was so dead I was embarrassing myself by even clocking it." Because it was. Then why were you managing the story for them? That hit Marla harder than him. She folded her arms and looked away. Not angry. Cornered. Again, maybe somebody else would read that as shame over being misread, not guilt. That is the problem with moments like this. Everything becomes dual use. A pause can mean dishonesty or humiliation. Looking away can mean you are hiding something, or you are just tired of being stared at through somebody else's marriage. Tessa said quietly, "He was trying to keep you from making it ugly." I looked at her. So there was something to keep contained. That is not what I said. It is exactly what you said. Dean's tone changed then. Less dismissive, colder. Ryan, you need to pick carefully here. That was new. Not calm down, not stop, not later. Pick carefully. I knew that language. It meant the conversation had left the level of what happened between Tessa and Marla and entered the level Dean cared about more. Family hierarchy. What gets repeated to which relatives, who looks stable, who gets painted as volatile. In our family, those things have real consequences. Money consequences. Estate consequences. My father has always treated composure like character and character like qualification. I said, "Is that supposed to sound neutral? It's supposed to sound like advice, from a guy answering for my wife." Tessa flinched at that. Small, but real. Dean saw it and got angrier, which was almost useful because anger made him sloppier. You want truth? Fine. They had history before you. They talked after dinner. They were seen having drinks. None of that equals cheating unless you need it to. There it was. The first time anyone used the word, without using it directly at me. Not cheating unless you need it to. I said, "Need it to?" And Tessa, who had been careful up to then, made the mistake that changed the shape of the hall. She said, "I didn't think one conversation needed reporting. One conversation. Not passing. Not nothing. Not weird upload behavior. One conversation." Dean closed his eyes for half a second like he knew she had just given me the only clean phrase I needed. One conversation. That phrase just sat there in the front hall, louder than it should have been. Not because it was a confession, because it replaced 3 weaker stories at once. Suddenly it was no longer a weird upload, or a passing run-in, or some harmless glitch in a shared album. It was one conversation, which meant there had been an actual private interaction to describe, and everybody except me seemed to know that was the safer version to land on. Dean knew it the second she said it. I could see it on his face. Marla looked down at the hardwood. Tessa kept the tape gun in her hand like she needed a task, even while the task was dead. And I stood there in the doorway of my own house, feeling that specific kind of humiliation that comes from realizing the people around you have been negotiating the language of a thing before you arrived. I said, "One conversation after a memorial dinner." Tessa answered carefully, "Yes." With her. Yes? For how long? Dean cut in immediately. That is not the point. It's exactly the point. No. The point is, you're taking old history and making it current because you can't stand ambiguity. I laughed once. Not because it was funny, because only my brother could hear his friend and my wife quietly admit they had a real private conversation after a date he personally downplayed, then pivot to my personality like that solved it. I turned to Tessa instead of him. How long? She looked at me. Really looked. Long enough that it should have been mentioned later. That answer bothered me because it was the closest anyone had come to honest without becoming useful. Long enough. Mentioned later. Those are adult phrases for, I knew this would sound bad. Not necessarily for I cheated, but absolutely, for I understood the optics and chose silence. Marla finally spoke. It wasn't romantic. Dean seized on that instantly. There. End of story. No, I said. That doesn't end anything. Marla's shoulders tightened. I mean it. We talked because seeing each other after that long was weird, and it felt stupid to pretend it wasn't. That would have helped if Dean had shut up. Instead, he kept rushing in like her translator, and every time he did, it made the air feel more arranged. I said, then why was Dean managing this for months? Tessa looked at him. So did Marla. That look mattered. Both of them, at the same time, toward him, not toward each other. Not toward me, toward my brother. Like he was the one who had been designated to hold the narrative together. That was the second turn in the part for me. The betrayal stayed centered on my wife and Marla's old connection, but my brother was starting to look less like a witness and more like an operator. Dean said, because you get locked on details and ruin rooms. That's your answer? It's the honest one. I could have denied it. I didn't, because part of the reason his line landed is that there is truth inside it. I do lock on details. I do have a talent for making people explain themselves, far past the point where everyone else thinks it's socially useful. Family has been calling it intense for years. Tessa has called it exhausting twice in fights and apologized both times. I still remember both times. That is the thing about being the person who notices too much. When you finally find something real, nobody wants to admit you may have been right without also reminding you how unpleasant you are when you chase it. I said, you still haven't answered the date. Dean crossed his arms. April 17th was a terrible night for everybody. That isn't an answer either. It is if you're not trying to build a prosecution. Tessa said quietly, Ryan, I turned to her. Did you tell him not to tell me? No. Too quick again. Marla looked up sharply at that. Dean didn't move. It was tiny, but it registered. Maybe Tessa meant no. Maybe she meant not in so many words. Maybe she meant she never directly requested a cover story and simply benefited from the one my brother offered. Moments like that are why viewer doubt lives. The room gives you fragments and then dares you to pick the ugliest interpretation. I said, did you tell him enough that he knew I shouldn't hear it cleanly? Tessa's jaw tightened. I told him I didn't want you turning one awkward conversation into proof of something current. Marla shut her eyes. Dean said, and she was right. I ignored him again. What was awkward about it? Tessa let out a slow breath. Seeing somebody who knew me before you did? That line hit harder than anything loud would have. Not sexual, not graphic, just intimate in the worst social way. Someone who knew her before I did. Someone with access to a previous version of her. Someone who apparently still mattered enough that a conversation after my mother's memorial dinner became a thing requiring later management. I said, and that needed privacy because it was not a scene I wanted in your mother's parking lot. That was plausible. Painfully plausible. If she had said that to me on April 18th, maybe we would have fought and then moved on. But that's not what happened. What happened was Dean flattened it. Tessa minimized it. Marla vanished into generic harmlessness, and then a timestamp in a shared album had to drag it back into daylight on moving day. Soft shift. The front door stayed open. The van still idled outside, and one of the neighbors walked past with a dog and glanced in through the wide doorway at the 3 half-stacked towers of boxes and the 4 adults no longer moving them. From the street, it probably looked like a normal move interrupted by a logistics dispute. Inside, it felt like the house had sorted itself into camps before we'd even unpacked a toaster. I said, so you talked after the dinner. Did you talk again? Dean snapped. No, wasn't asking you, Tessa answered after a beat. Not like that. I looked at her. Not like that means yes. It means not privately in the same way. Marla's face changed at that. Just a little. Not shock. Not guilt exactly. More like she hated the phrasing and knew it was still technically survivable. Which made me hate it too. Dean stepped in front of the stair, opening now. Not aggressively, just occupying space the way he does when he thinks presence itself should reset the terms. Ryan, enough. No. You are not going to stand here and make her define every interaction she has ever had. Not every interaction. The ones you buried. He stared at me long enough that I knew the conversation had moved again. Not away from betrayal, deeper into family power. Dean has always tolerated anger. What he does not tolerate is losing control of who gets to narrate a family incident. And in our family, narrative bleeds into inheritance faster than anybody outside it would believe. My father likes certainty, loyalty, calm. Dean has built his whole adult life to look like those things even when he isn't them. I said, "Why were you so invested in me not seeing this?" He gave me a flat look. "Because you were about to move your wife into a house half our father helped secure, and I didn't need one of your episodes turning that into family theater." Episodes. There it was. That old word. Not concern. Not caution. Something clinical enough to mark me as the unstable variable, and him as the adult. Tessa immediately said, "Dean, stop." Marla looked stunned. Maybe she had not heard him use that word before. Maybe Tessa had and just forgot how ugly it sounds when said out loud in daylight. I smiled at him without warmth. That's interesting. He knew he had overreached. I could see it. But overreaching never makes Dean retreat. It makes him harden. "It's true," he said. And just like that, the man who was supposedly helping my move had become more dangerous to me than my wife. The word sat there between us longer than it should have. Episodes. Not because it was new, because it wasn't. Dean only used that word when he wanted to drag me back into a version of myself he could control. 12 years old. Too intense, too fixated, too emotional for the men in our family to trust with the practical stuff. He had not said it in front of Tessa before. He had definitely not said it in front of Marla. The second it left his mouth, the whole shape of the front hall changed. Tessa said, sharper now, "Don't do that." Dean kept his eyes on me. "I'm not doing anything. I'm saying what this becomes when he gets like this." I laughed once, dry enough that even I hated the sound. Gets like what? Remembers dates? Outside, the van beeped again because the back door had been left open too long. Soft shift. Street noise. A dog barking somewhere down the block. The townhouse front hall still crowded with half-sealed boxes and an open stack of framed photos no one wanted to touch now. Moving day was still technically happening, but it had been demoted. The real work had moved to language. Marla looked at Dean and then away again. "Can we not turn this into family history?" That was the first useful thing she had said, and it did not help her. I said, "That's exactly what it is now." Dean turned on her before I could keep going. "You don't need to engage." There, again, protecting her. Not Tessa, not me, her. Tessa clocked it too. I could tell from the way her mouth tightened. Maybe that meant nothing romantic. Maybe it only meant she was tired of him treating Marla like the fragile point in the room. But once your wife and your brother's friend have an old history sitting on a date everybody remembers, even ordinary protectiveness starts sounding loaded. I said, "Why are you more worried about her than my marriage?" Dean exhaled through his nose. "Because your marriage isn't being attacked by reality. It's being attacked by your need to force reality into one shape." That is the kind of sentence that sounds clever when you say it fast. It also avoids everything. I stepped around the lamp base and moved farther into the hall, away from the open door. Not retreating, just changing the ground. If I stayed in the threshold, Dean could keep using the doorway like he owned the frame of the argument. Inside, near the staircase and the stacked book boxes, the room felt narrower, less public, worse in a way, better in another. "Fine," I said. "One shape. Here's one. You told me the past between them was dead." Tessa admits they had one private conversation after the memorial dinner. Marla's album has a timestamp from that night. And for months, every time I noticed anything off, you told me I was inventing it. Tessa said my name quietly. Warning, exhaustion, maybe regret. Hard to tell. I looked at her. "Did you tell me the whole truth about that night?" She paused. That pause was not dramatic. That is what made it brutal. Not a long movie silence. Just enough time for me to watch her choose whether truth meant detail or defense. "I told you the part that mattered to me," she said. I nearly smiled at that, and not in a good way. That is an incredible sentence. Dean muttered, "Jesus Christ." No, I said, without looking at him. This is great, because now we're learning everybody here has a private definition of enough. Tessa's face went flat. Ryan, do not start performing. There it was. Not from Dean this time. From her. Performing. Another word that turns the hurt person into the event instead of the event into the hurt. Maybe she was right. Maybe by then I was speaking too evenly, too clipped, too much like a man trying not to throw anything in a front hall full of wedding china. But the thing about being accused of performance is that it often comes right after you stop making the other person comfortable. I said, "Did you want me to know about April 17th before or after we closed on the townhouse?" "We didn't close on anything," Dean snapped. Dad fronted the down payment structure. "Don't say it like you bought this place in a vacuum." There it was, the second channel. Not just betrayal now, money, family capital, ownership. The old invisible math finally spoken aloud. My father's help had never been a gift in the clean sense. It was family architecture. Dean had always understood how to live inside it better than I did. I looked at him. "Thanks." That clarified a lot. "Good." "No, I mean it. Because now I know where you've been talking from all day." Tessa looked between us. "What is that supposed to mean?" I answered her, but my eyes stayed on him. "It means my brother thinks this house belongs to the branch of the family that behaves properly, and he's suddenly very interested in whether I qualify." Dean's jaw shifted, but he did not deny it. That was the ugly genius of him. He rarely denied the most damaging thing if he thought he could make you sound paranoid for noticing it first. Marla said, "I don't want to be in this." I almost said you already are. Instead, I asked the only thing that still mattered to me more than Dean's language. "Tessa, after April 17th, did you see her alone again?" Marla froze. Tessa looked at me with that expression I hate most on her face, not because it is cruel, but because it is merciful. She gets gentle when she thinks the truth will wound worse than ambiguity, and maybe she is right about that more often than I want to admit. But mercy used in place of honesty is just control with softer hands. "No," she said. "Too clean." "Not once. We were around each other in groups." "That isn't the question." "No," she said again, and this time it came slower. "Not alone." Marla swallowed and looked down at the phone still in her hand. That tiny motion kept the doubt alive for me. Maybe unfairly. Maybe because by then I needed every micro-reaction to mean something. This is one of the places people would argue with me if they heard the story. They would say I had already decided what hurt would count, and was reading the room through that bruise. They would not be fully wrong. Still, Marla did not look like someone listening to a simple, truthful answer. She looked like someone hoping the answer would hold. Dean said, "Can we put the boxes inside now, or do you need to interrogate everyone by square footage?" I ignored him. "Then why did April 17th need so much editing?" Tessa answered before he could. "Because I knew how it would sound." There it was again. The closest thing to honesty in the room belonged to the person with the most to lose and the least appetite for spectacle. "And now?" I asked. She looked at me. "Now it sounds worse because you're hearing it from a timestamp in a hallway." That was probably true. I hated that it was true. The house creaked somewhere above us, one of those old wood settling sounds new places make when they are not yet yours. It felt absurd that we were standing in the front hall of a townhouse I had spent months planning for, measuring for, picturing our future in, and the most solid thing in it was an old date nobody had told me straight. Dean took one step closer. "Ryan, listen carefully. I actually laughed that time. There's that tone. I'm serious. I can tell." His voice lowered. "If you turn this into some public family accusation tonight, Dad is going to hear that you moved into a house he helped secure and immediately blew it up over an old photo and your own obsession." There it was. Not hinted now. Clear enough to touch. Inheritance pressure. Not the will itself. Not a signed threat. Nothing theatrical. Something worse in our family. Prepositioning. Dean naming how the story would be told upward. How composure would be assigned, how future money would be attached to character, how character would be attached to my behavior instead of his, or Tessa's, or Marla's. I looked at him for a long second. Then I said, "You sound less like my brother than my father's secretary." Tessa closed her eyes. Marla whispered, "Dean." But he was past pretending now. "No," he said. "I sound like the only person here who understands consequences." And in that moment, I believed him. Not because he was right morally, because he was right about the family weapon he was willing to use. Once Dean said consequences, the whole front hall got simpler and uglier at the same time. Until then, there had still been a thin layer of deniability over what he was doing. Protective brother, bad timing, family trying to keep a move from turning into a bloodbath. But once he brought my father into it that directly, once he framed the entire day as a story that could be carried upward and translated into whether I looked stable enough to keep benefiting from family money, he stopped being my witness and became my problem. Tessa saw it too. "Dean, stop," she said. He didn't even look at her. "No." Marla took a small step backward toward the coat hooks, still clutching her phone. She looked like she wanted to disappear without making the movement noticeable. That probably would have worked on anybody except me. By then, I was noticing everything, which is both my worst habit and, on days like that, the only reason anyone ever has trouble getting away with half-truths in front of me. I said, "Go ahead. Say it clean." Dean stared at me. "Say what? That if I don't swallow this the way you want, you'll make sure Dad hears I'm unstable and reckless with the house." "That is not what I said." "No," I replied. "It's what you meant." Tessa put the tape gun down on top of a box marked plates and folded her arms. Not protective, not warm, just bracing herself. "Ryan," I looked at her. "No, I want him to say it." Dean laughed once, short and irritated. "You always do this. You force everyone into the ugliest wording so you can feel justified. There are people who say things like that because they are innocent and sick of being twisted. Dean says things like that because he knows the ugly wording is often the true one, and he prefers living in paraphrase. I've known that about him since we were teenagers, and he could talk our father into thinking I was the difficult one, even when Dean had started the whole problem by hiding the part that mattered. Still, if somebody wanted to tell me I was forcing the moment into the harshest possible version because I needed one clean villain, I couldn't dismiss that entirely either. That is the miserable part. Dean was threatening me, and I still had enough self-awareness to know he might later be able to describe my reaction in a way that would sound worse than his. I said, "Then tell me the kinder wording." He didn't. Exactly. The front door was still open. A gust moved through the hall and lifted the corner of one of the packing labels near the stairs. Soft shift. Heat from outside. The smell of tape adhesive. The little scrape of a box settling as somebody's bad stacking job gave up by an inch. The house felt suspended between being ours and being a set for somebody else's family lesson. Tessa said, very quietly, "Ryan, not with him. Ask me." That stopped me for a second. Because she was right. Or at least right enough to matter. Dean had become so offensive, so nakedly strategic, that if I kept centering him, I would lose the thread that actually cut. My wife, my brother's friend, and the old history neither of them had trusted me with in plain language. I turned back to Tessa. "Fine," I said. "Tell me what I still don't know." She looked relieved for maybe half a second, then immediately looked worse, because the question itself was impossible to answer well. That alone said plenty. Marla spoke first. "You know the relevant part." Dean shot her a look. "Stop volunteering." I pointed at him without taking my eyes off either woman. "He doesn't talk now." He actually stepped forward, and I stepped forward too. Not chest to chest. Just enough that we both understood the line. He stopped. That was the moment I knew something else ugly. Dean had already overplayed his hand. Not because he lost power, because he had shown it too clearly. Whatever happened next with the family money, the house, my father, I would at least never again be able to pretend my brother's version of help came without teeth. Tessa said, "After the dinner, Marla and I sat in her car." I heard the street outside go faint for a second, like my own body had turned the volume down. "In her car," I repeated. "It was parked out back. We talked. For how long? I don't know. 40 minutes? Maybe an hour." Dean muttered, "Jesus." I ignored him. That was more than one conversation. Not technically, maybe. Still one conversation if you want to argue semantics. But it was long enough to hold weather, long enough to revive feeling, clear history, test whether old chemistry still had a pulse. Not proof, never proof. Just intimacy in a form people love to minimize when they are the ones benefiting from it. I asked, "About what?" Tessa rubbed one thumb into her palm. "About who we used to be." Marla shut her eyes. I laughed again, and that laugh sounded cruel even to me. That is such an unbelievably bad sentence to hear on moving day. "It wasn't planned," Tessa said. "No, I'm sure it just happened." "It did." "Then why keep it from me?" "Because I knew hearing it later from me would still hurt, and hearing it in the moment would have detonated the dinner." There it was. A logic I could actually follow. Self-serving, maybe. Cowardly, definitely. But human. I hated how human it sounded. If she had said, "Nothing happened, end of story," I could have called it flat denial. Instead, she gave me something messier and therefore more believable. That she chose silence not because she thought I'd never care, but because she thought the timing would make me care even more. That did not help her. It helped my understanding of how I got here. I said, "Did you want to see whether it was still there?" She looked at me. That was one of the 3 moments. If I had to pick them later, that would keep viewers arguing forever. Because she didn't answer quickly. She didn't answer cleanly. She just looked at me with the saddest expression I'd seen on her face in months, which could mean guilt, grief, exhaustion, or the simple pain of being asked the truest question before you've prepared a survivable answer. Finally, she said, "I wanted to understand why it still affected me." Dean made an impatient sound, like he couldn't believe she had just said that out loud. Marla looked like she might cry and was furious at herself for it. I said, "So yes." "No," Tessa said. "Not yes in the way you're framing it." Again with that. "It matters. Does it?" "Yes." Maybe it did. Maybe it didn't. Maybe the difference between I wanted to see if it was still there and I wanted to understand why it still affected me was meaningful to people who had not just moved into a house, financed partly by the same family member now threatening, to classify my reaction as instability. To me, in that front hall, the distinction felt more literary than moral. Dean said, "You got your answer. Now drop it." That actually made me smile. "You think that helped?" It clarified enough. For who? For any reasonable person. There it was again. Reasonable. The family's favorite word for obedience with better posture. I turned to him. "You keep using that like you're not the one who threatened to carry a version of this to Dad if I don't handle it correctly." He spread his hands. "I'm telling you actions have costs. Only mine? No. But yours are the ones that determine whether tonight becomes a family catastrophe. The house, the money, the father, the inheritance." It was all in that sentence without being fully named. And in a way, he was right. If I wanted to keep my standing in the family architecture, the smart move was probably to keep this narrow, private, deniable. That was exactly why his pressure worked, and exactly why I hated him for using it. I looked back at Tessa. "Did anything happen after the car?" She answered immediately this time. "No," Marla said at the same moment. "No." Dean stayed silent. That should have helped. Maybe it did a little. 2 matching no's. No dramatic delay. No weird overlap. Still, the intimacy damage was already done. My wife had sat in another woman's car after my mother's memorial dinner, talking for close to an hour about who they used to be. Then let my brother flatten the story into almost nothing while I kept moving toward a future I thought was at least honestly mine. I said, "And you both just decided I'd never need the full version." Tessa's eyes flicked toward Dean and back. I decided I was scared of the full version. That one landed, because it was probably the cleanest truth in the house. And because my brother immediately said there was no full version, which made it obvious he still thought control mattered more than honesty. There was no full version. Dean said it like volume could settle meaning. Not loud, just flat and final. The way he has always spoken when he thinks the right tone can replace the right answer. Nobody in the front hall believed him fully by then. Maybe not even Dean. Tessa looked tired in a way I had not seen since the first year we were married, when we still thought honesty was the kind of thing you could postpone without changing its shape. Marla had stopped trying to leave. That was almost worse. She looked like someone who knew movement itself would read as guilt now, so all she could do was stay still and hope stillness looked less damning than escape. I said, "You don't get to define full version for me." Dean's expression changed just a little. Not softer, sharper. That tiny shift that always came before he stopped pretending to be the reasonable brother and became the family enforcer. Some people do that with volume. Dean does it by sounding more administrative. "You're making a mistake," he said. "There it is again." "I'm serious." "So am I." He folded his arms. "You have a house half secured through family money, a wife telling you exactly what happened, and one old date you're refusing to let go of because it gives you an excuse to blow up your life on moving day." That would have sounded persuasive to anyone who hadn't been standing there for the previous hour. And even to me, it had enough truth mixed in to sting. I did have one old date. I was refusing to let go of it. I was absolutely in danger of blowing up my life in a front hall full of unopened boxes. But he kept saying wife telling you exactly what happened, as if I had not just learned that exactly included an hour in a parked car after my mother's memorial dinner, talking about who she and Marla used to be. In our family, the trick is never to lie so hard that people can pin you. It is to lie downward, to shrink, to pre-edit, to keep every true thing just under the threshold of what another person would reasonably be allowed to call betrayal, Tessa said quietly. "Dean, stop helping." That surprised all of us. He looked at her like she'd slapped him. "Excuse me?" I said, "Stop helping." For the first time all day, she sounded angry in a clean direction. Not at me for noticing. Not at Marla for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. At him, soft shift. Same front hall, same boxes, same open door. But the alignment changed. Dean was no longer protecting the women from me. He was being told, out loud, that his version of protection had become poison. He laughed once, bitter and short. "Amazing." "No," Tessa said. "What's amazing is that every time Ryan gets close to the part that matters, you start talking like a banker. I did not expect the rush of relief that gave me, and I hated that too. Because even then, even after everything, part of me still wanted my wife to pick a side and show me she could see the actual injury instead of just the fallout." Dean looked at me. "You believe this helps you?" I said, "It helps me know she at least knows what hurt." Marla finally spoke, voice thin now. "I never asked him to do any of this." Dean turned on her. "No one said you did." She held his gaze longer than I expected. "You didn't need to be managing it like I was going to break." That landed harder than anything theatrical could have. Not because it proved romance, because it clarified the dynamic. Dean had not only been downplaying the old history to me, he had also been curating the whole room around Marla like she was the priority to stabilize. I asked the question before I could stop myself. "Why did you care so much?" Dean looked at me like he couldn't believe I still needed that explained. "Because somebody in this house has to think past the next 10 minutes. "No," I said. "Why did you care so much about her?" He went still. There it was. The same stillness that had followed the first timestamp question, the same little vacuum where denial should have gone if the answer were easy. Tessa saw it. So did Marla. You can tell when a room collectively hears the hinge in a man, even when nothing has been admitted yet. "You kidding me?" Dean said finally. "No." His mouth pulled tight. "She's my friend. More than she's mine. That's not the point. It absolutely is. Again, not proof. Just another social bruise. Another way intimacy can move through a room without anybody crossing into anything you can cleanly prosecute. My brother defending his friend more fiercely than my marriage. My wife protecting the emotional meaning of a conversation she chose not to tell me about. Marla standing in my front hall with an album that dragged the wrong date into daylight. None of it definitive. All of it enough. The street outside had gone quieter as afternoon tipped toward evening. The van finally stopped idling. Somebody had turned it off at some point during all this, which felt symbolic in a way I resented. Moving day. Suspended. A life paused, because 4 adults could not agree on how much truth had been withheld. or why. I took my house keys out of my pocket and looked at them for a second. Dean noticed. "What are you doing?" "Thinking." "That's never your weak spot." I almost smiled at that. Almost. Then I did the second real thing I had done all day. The first had been refusing to drop the timestamp. The second was smaller, but maybe more important. I held the keys out to Tessa, not gently, not cruelly, just clearly. She stared at them. "What is that?" "It's me deciding I'm not sleeping in this house tonight, pretending nothing changed." Her face lost color. "Ryan," Dean said instantly, "don't be dramatic." I turned to him. "You don't get to use that word anymore." Then back to Tessa. "You stay. Or don't. I don't care right this second. But I'm done doing the version where everybody around me edits the shape of a thing and I'm supposed to feel grateful if the words sound calm." She did not take the keys. That hurt worse than I expected. Not because I wanted her to choose the house, because I wanted her to choose something quickly. Me, the truth, a side against Dean, something. Instead, she just stood there with the same look she had worn half the day, sad enough to feel real, controlled enough to remain useful. "I did not cheat on you," she said. And there it was at last. Late. Plain. Almost insultingly late. I looked at her for a long second. Maybe she was telling the truth. Maybe she had been telling a version of it all day. Maybe that car conversation after the memorial dinner had been exactly what she described, a badly judged orbit around old history, emotional and private, and disloyal in feeling without ever crossing into something everyone would cleanly label physical betrayal. Maybe. But the problem with plain denials delivered after 3 hours of minimizing is that they do not arrive in a vacuum. They arrive dragging all the earlier omissions behind them. I said, "That is not the only line," Dean scoffed. "Unbelievable." "No," I said, without looking at him. "What's unbelievable is that you thought threatening me with Dad would make me trust any of this more." His jaw tightened. "I was trying to protect the family. There it is," I said. "Not me, not my marriage, the family." He did not answer. He didn't need to. The silence confirmed more than any clean sentence could have. Tessa finally took the keys, but only to set them on the hall table beside a box of framed photos. Another maybe choice. Another partial act. She looked at me and said, "If you leave now, it will look exactly how he says." I actually laughed at that. Not meanly, just tired. Then he can enjoy the story. I picked up my bag from under the stairs. My overnight bag, the one I had packed because I thought the first night in the new house should feel deliberate. Fresh sheets, toothbrush, phone charger, one change of clothes, normal future stuff. It felt obscene in my hands suddenly. Marla stepped aside without a word when I moved toward the door. Dean didn't. He stood there for 1 second too long, forcing me either to wait or to make him move. That's his style. Control through slight inconvenience. Then later he calls your reaction disproportionate. I held his gaze. He moved. No apology, no warning, no final brotherly appeal. Just one step to the left and a face like he was already composing tomorrow's version. Outside, the air felt warmer than the house. I could hear my own pulse in the quiet after the front hall. I made it to the curb before Tessa called my name from the doorway. I turned, because of course, I turned. She stood just inside the frame of the house we had spent months planning, with Dean somewhere behind her and Marla not visible at all. For 1 second, it looked almost ordinary, like any spouse calling after a bad fight. "I'm not lying about that line," she said, meaning cheating, meaning that one line. I believed she believed it. That was the worst part, because I also believed there were other lines she had crossed, long before moving day, and long before she ever decided I deserved the full shape of April 17th. Emotional ones, loyalty ones, the kind that only look minor if you are the person deciding what counts. I nodded once. Not forgiveness. Not agreement. Just acknowledgement that the conversation had finally reached the sentence she wished she'd started with. Then I got in my car and drove away from the townhouse before I had unpacked a single box. By night, Dean had already texted me twice. First to say I was making a temporary thing permanent. Then to say Dad had heard I left in a state and wanted to talk before the week was out. There it was, quick as promised. Family money turned into family judgment before sunset. In our world, inheritance doesn't get threatened with dramatic speeches. It gets chilled, delayed, reconsidered. Your character starts being discussed in rooms you're not in. Tessa sent one message only. I meant what I said, but I should have told you sooner. I stared at it for a long time in the parking lot outside a cheap hotel off the highway. That was the backfire, I think. Dean had tried to contain the day, contain me, contain the marriage, inside one sanitized version fit for my father's ears. Instead, he made himself look like the one person in the room who understood exactly how much truth had been withheld and was willing to weaponize family money to keep it that way. And me? I still did not have the kind of proof people online love. No body, no confession, no neat final line. Just a timestamp, a remembered date, an hour in a car talking about who they used to be, and a brother who moved faster to protect his friend and the family narrative than he ever moved to protect me. Sometimes that is not enough to end a marriage cleanly. Sometimes it is more than enough to poison the house before you even sleep in it.